Okay, so to start with, as Buddhists, we are asked to face into the truth of the way things are. I think it's really important to enter this discussion with full awareness of what is at stake, with awareness of the extent and gravity of the climate and ecological emergency that we're facing. Otherwise, it can become an interesting, absorbing, even fascinating discussion that is divorced from the real world and lacks urgency and reality. Now, I'm sure a lot of you, perhaps all of you, will be familiar with the facts of the climate and ecological emergency. But I know from my own experience that it's so easy to forget and to drift into complacency or into numbness. You know, we come down in the morning, the muesli's still there, everything looks fairly normal. It's very easy to get lulled into a sense of everything going on as normal, even with the COVID crisis in some ways. So I'm going to do a very brief whistle-stop tour of the facts of the climate crisis. So we now know that the rate of extinction of species means that we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. Human activities have caused the world's wildlife populations to plummet by more than 2/3 in the last 50 years. And humans, plus domesticated livestock, now account for 96% by biomass of all life on Earth. The amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere is approaching a level not seen for the last 800,000 years at least. And on our current trajectory, we're heading for a global average temperature increase of at least 3.2 degrees centigrade, which could occur as early as 2060, according to a recent UN report. This would intensify mass extinction, and large parts of the globe would become uninhabitable. We can expect starvation, intensified extreme weather events, mass migration, and armed conflict. We have about 8 years to reduce CO2 levels, carbon dioxide levels, by 45% if we're to have any chance of avoiding that, and that's from the latest IPCC report in 2018. The Earth's oceans are acidifying, heating up and rising as a result of atmospheric heating and carbon dioxide increase. Acidification is causing mass die-offs of coral reefs, which are the breeding ground for many species of fish and feed a large proportion of the population. Half of the Great Barrier Reef has been bleached to death since 2016. We can expect further escalation of extreme storms, storm surges and flooding. And this will affect coastal cities and communities across the planet. And it's important not to forget that the poorer communities and countries around the world are the first to experience these impacts, although they've done the least to contribute to the problem. James Hansen, former director of NASA, an outspoken speaker on climate crisis, has said that the Earth's warming has brought us to the precipice of a great tipping point. If we go over the edge, it will be a transition to a different planet, an environment far outside the range that has been experienced by humanity. There will be no return within the lifetime of any generation that can be imagined, and it will exterminate a large fraction of species on this planet. So it's all pretty hard to take. And so I had to say to myself, well, is there any hope in all this? Then I thought, well, maybe Buddhists don't need hope, but I'm going to offer some in any case. The chief of the UN Environment Programme recently said this. Is it possible to avert disaster? Yes, absolutely. Will it take political will? Yes. Will we need to have the private sector lean in? Yes. But the science tells us that we can do this. And I think the election of Biden in the USA to me, is looking very impressive and very hopeful. The way he's embedded the reality of the climate into every sector of government. He's consulting with local people, with indigenous people, with people that are affected by pollution. It really looks like he's taking this seriously, and he's devoted $2 trillion, I think it is, to the climate project. And even the private sector industry, from car manufacturers to, dare I say it, the banking world, is actually waking up. But action needs to be swift, and it needs to be radical. We will see what COP26 in Glasgow brings. Of course, Extinction Rebellion Buddhists will be there making it happen. So I hope you can join us. So it's against this background then. Oops. A brief hello from someone. It's against this background then that I'd like to share a few reflections on the questions in front of us, which I hope will be food for thought. And just to remind you, these are the questions. Firstly, what are appropriate responses to the climate and ecological emergency? Secondly, what can climate activists learn from Buddhism? And finally, where does Buddhism and XR activism converge and diverge? So I'm going to offer some reflections drawn from my own personal experience and perspective of activism, which I hope will be some fertile ground for the discussion that we're going to have in our groups. So the climate crisis is and will be the cause of widespread suffering, particularly within communities that are often largely ignored. This includes non-dominant cultures in the global south and non-human species across the globe. It's easy to get overwhelmed or numbed out by the statistics and to forget how much suffering is being and will be experienced. The image of a koala bear wandering listlessly as if bewildered in a burning forest in Australia last year, with its fur smouldering, was incredibly painful to watch. I don't know how many of you saw that image. I think it was quite widely disseminated. The fact that now only 4% of all life on Earth by mass is wild is, to me, a devastating statistic. And the image of hundreds of endangered sea turtles washed up dead in the coast of Mexico last year, which I saw, I think, on a David Attenborough broadcast, because of early floods, was just really hard to look at. So what can I do? Referring back to the first question, what are appropriate responses to the climate and ecological emergency? You may be aware that the phrase "an appropriate response" is from Zen master Wenyan in the 9th century. It was a typically pithy Zen response to the question from a student, which was, "What are the teachings of your entire lifetime?" And Wenyan simply said, "An appropriate response." I think there are 3 points when addressing the appropriateness question, which I take to be a kind of a koan. Firstly, what is an appropriate response to the level of urgency? Secondly, what is an appropriate response in view of our personal capacities? And thirdly, what is an appropriate response in view of our alignment with our precious faith tradition? So I'm just going to dig down a little bit on those. So to look at the first one, starting with the level of urgency. What is an appropriate response? The threat to the planet is imminent. It would surely be foolish to sit in the path of a number 52 bus whilst contemplating the essential emptiness of all phenomena. It is appropriate to do what we can to get out of the way. I want to apologise for the slightly London-centric image there, but it's the best I could come up with. If you maybe it should be an elephant. You may be aware of the Pali word samvega. Samvega means spiritual urgency, and it's defined, one of the definitions I found was a chastening sense of our own complacency in the face of suffering. It refers to waking up to the realities of old age, of sickness and of death, of how we've been living so blindly and complacently. Bhikkhu Bodhi has said that in the light of the climate and ecological crisis, we are invited not to panic, but to fiercely and decisively respond. Now, this doesn't determine what we do, but it does inform the urgency and the energy with which we do it. Secondly, what is appropriate to our personal capacities, to our talents and our passions? There are many and varied ways we can engage in the crisis, and it makes sense to find a way to engage which is in alignment with our abilities, our interests, and our life circumstances. We need to engage with what moves us, with what evokes our passions and our compassion. As Howard Thurman, civil rights activist, has said, ask what makes you come alive and go and do it, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And thirdly, how we act needs to be appropriate to or in alignment with our faith tradition, because our faith is an invaluable and irreplaceable sustaining and guiding force, especially in this time of crisis. With its depth, with its richness and its clarity, our faith is an indispensable compass, which we can return to time and time again. And now to speak to the question, what can climate activists learn from Buddhism? I'd like to show you some slides from our actions and invite you to be aware of what is evoked in you as you see these images. So I'm now going to share my screen. Please bear with me. My tech skills are limited. Okay, so I'm just going to scroll through this. I'm not going to say anything, just to invite you to see what arises as you watch, as you see the images. So I'm going to share my own response. So what I see in these images is embodied equanimity in the face of threat. But please feel free to have your own responses, whatever they may be. What I see in the images is embodied equanimity in the face of threat, the threat from the police ranks or a disapproving public, and equanimity in our willingness to face into the threat of the climate emergency. And I would submit that the Buddhist deliberate cultivation and capacity for equanimity as an embodied experience is a key quality that is perhaps unique to Buddhism, although I would be interested to hear from other faith traditions on this point. I'd like to add, though, that engagement in nonviolent direct action is also a means by which our practice develops and deepens. Perhaps in particular, our capacity to hold strong emotions like fear, agitation, or intense excitement are stretched and challenged during engagement. So while we approach action with equanimity, our equanimity is also developing. It is, after all, surely when we are challenged that we make progress on the path. Insight and development is rarely the result of an easy life. And I have to add that not all of activism is fear. A lot of it actually evokes joy and love as we witness the courage and the beauty of our fellow activists. A few comments on where do Buddhism and Extinction Rebellion diverge and converge now. Is being a nuisance to the general public, being loud, or being openly opposed to something, which are all part of the XR approach to activism, in keeping with our faith? How does it sit with us? Perhaps this partly depends on how we frame and approach what we're doing. The felt experience of seeing ourselves as simply being in opposition to is radically different, I think, than taking a stand for something that we hold dear, even though they might both result in the same action. An oppositional stance is aimed at the wrongness of the other, the damage, for example, done by oil exploration, and can lead into blame and outer-directed anger. Taking a stand against oil exploration on the basis of the damage and pain inflicted upon wildlife or indigenous people comes much more from compassion and results in the quality of fierce passion. But there may be actions that Extinction Rebellion do that we feel after reflection are beyond our vows or non-harming or right speech or right action. And this is for each of us to determine in conversation with ourselves and our sanghas. And can we include the possibility that there are at times maybe that we're clinging to our faith or hiding on our cushions rather than just taking refuge? So instead of using our faith and practices as a route from which we grow into the world, we stay safe and protected. This goes back to the question of personal appropriateness again, which I referred to above. Have we found what really matters to us in all this? What is right for us at this time and in our lives? There is also the question, of course, what is activism anyway? Is talking to friends about the climate crisis or engaging in forums like this part of activism? Is sitting in vigil in our gardens or public places a form of activism? My own decision to risk arrest was undoubtedly the culmination of a movement or flow which started with less direct actions. Perhaps we might think about our contribution, whatever it is, as a small stream or tributary, one of many such streams that feeds into a powerful river. We should not lose sight of the fact that we are all a part of something much larger than ourselves. And so to conclude, it is often said that there are two wings to the Buddhist path, wisdom and love, which suffuse and balance each other. Drawing upon these resources, we can be steady and powerful. From this place of interconnection, beyond our small sense of self, from our experience of the lived reality of interconnectedness, we can perhaps, if we listen deeply, get an inkling of what our earth needs of us and what our hearts needs, and perhaps find that they are, after all, the same. And this is to invite our Buddha nature. To ask what would the Buddha do is also to ask, what does the Buddha within speak from our heart? What does it say when we listen? When we listen in those rare and precious moments of deep silence, when we contemplate the terrible suffering that is already being inflicted upon our world. And when we contemplate too the beauty of the potential that is within us, within this human form, and which is reflected in the life forms with which we are privileged to share this world. And so these are some of the thoughts and reflections which I hope might be of some use to you as you go through the next hour or so. So my invitation is to listen deeply, to listen patiently, without expectation to what emerges in you. There is no right or wrong feeling or thought, only the invitation to remain as far as possible in contact with yourself. As we lean into the realities of this crisis, into this suffering world, which is yet so alive and so astonishingly complex and achingly beautiful. Thank you for listening.